Well, here's 5 minutes on exorcism. It's a subject that cheers almost everybody up. Normally when people ask me what I do for a living, I say I do past life regression. But if I'm in a certain mood or being called for jury duty, I say I'm an exorcist. I love to watch the look on people's faces. They usually think I'm joking, and hey, they have a laugh, I have a laugh. But, the good news, okay, there's good news and bad news. The good news about exorcism is that it's the fastest way of healing a lot of problems that exists. People walk out my door with problems they didn't have when they walked in. The woman whose blood pressure was spiking over 200 every day, who told me she spent $10,000 on Blue Cross co-pays. And being a retired nurse, she knew her medicine pretty well. She had this really dangerous condition and nobody could figure out how to fix it. And after a session in which I removed a critter from her, she walked out the door with normal blood pressure and it stayed that way. Just think how much time and money she had spent doing something that ended up taking 3 hours and cost her a couple $100. There you go. But maybe it would be fun if I told you about my first experience with an entity. Because when I started doing past life regression, I hadn't been taught much about entities. But this was an instance that I couldn't ignore. It involved a woman of about 20 who was a lovely, small, China doll-like woman with the kind of skin you can see through. You can see the veins through it. She was very delicate. I did the hypnosis induction with her. I asked her my first question, and this voice came out of her. "You think you're talking to Susan, don't you?" "Well, you're not." And I was like, well, so who am I talking to? So I proceeded to have a conversation with this growly character, and I figured out some way to pull him out of her. And I guess I didn't realize I'd done this in previous lifetimes at the time. And that was my first conversation with an entity. Over the years, I've talked to people's entities while people are in hypnosis. So many thousand times I don't even know how to count. I usually want to, ask them questions and find out, are there things they like my client to do, or things they like my client to not do, or do they like my client's spouse or not like them, or a whole variety of things, because these things can energize behavior patterns, addictions in some cases, various physical problems, mostly emotional problems. One young man I worked with had been diagnosed as psychotic and already put on state disability for the rest of his life. And after the second hypnosis session I did with him, all the symptoms that got him diagnosed as psychotic were gone. I kept track of him for quite some time and they never returned. So that's the good news, is that it's a very direct kind of healing. The bad news is we have to consider that there are conscious presences around us that we can't see. And that's a pretty annoying thing to get your hands around. But, with some experience you get used to it. And I teach my clients some simple ways that they can protect themselves from that sort of thing, or deal with it if, they suspect something like that has occurred. I don't think I completed my previous thought about questioning the entity to find out what effect they've had, finding out what age my client was when the entity got there, and so that my client knows, that this particular effect has been in their life, and all this time they thought it was coming from something else, that they had an issue or a problem, or they may have spent years in psychotherapy working this thing around, but since the problem was coming from a consciousness that is not themselves, therapy doesn't work very well for that. So the client gets a lot smarter about their problem, but the problem is coming from something that isn't the client. So getting rid of that is the most direct way to deal with the problem. Sometimes these things turn out kind of funny. In one instance, a woman in her first regression found tuned into the end of the lifetime of a 14 or 15-year-old shepherd, a boy who died, I think he fell off a cliff or something. And he went into some gray space, and then that was my clue. When somebody dies and they don't go up, I want to find out where they went. So I directed him to go to the first time he saw my client. And the typical description from the entity's point of view is they're looking down on someone, and gradually they just kind of move in. So my client was 2 years old, and at the time, and I had some conversation with him before removing him. And after we finished the session, my client told me that as long as she could remember, there'd been this male voice in her head that was almost criticizing her. Now, about 6 months later, I recall a conversation with the same client, and she told me that that critical voice had been gone ever since. And then she said, but in a way, I kind of miss having that conversation, and, since I'm not having that conversation in my head, I've been listening to my husband a lot more, and I never realized how boring he is. So, I just loved it. There you go.